Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Master Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and today my guest is Benny Grotto. Benny runs Mad Oak Studios out of Boston, and he's known for his works with bands like Aerosmith, Ben Folds, the Dresden Dolls, Weird Al Yankovic, and so many more. And inside of this conversation, we have a really great chat about the importance of producers and the techniques that a producer can bring to a session in order to create the best performances out of an artist. And we talk about how a producer can coach a musician, but without stepping on their toes and, offending and upsetting people. Instead, there's a bit more of a subtle art to this if you want to work with musicians. You have to be very tactful in the way you ask people to try things, and you obviously don't want to offend people. So Benny has so many great tips inside of this episode, and I think you're just going to love them. These are things that likely you've never heard before unless you've been in a room with an experienced producer, someone who does this every single day and who has developed these techniques. Producers have so many tricks up their sleeves, and inside of this episode, Benny shares a ton of great tips. So with that said, I'm excited for you to dig into this. Let's just jump right into the episode. Benny Grotto, thank you so much for being on the Master Mix podcast. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
No problem. For people who might not be familiar with you and your background, can you give us a little bit of that story on who you are, what you do, and how you got into this?
Sure. I am a Boston-based producer and engineer and mixer. I'm a co-owner of a studio here in town called Mad Oak Studios. We've been at it for a couple decades now. I've been here since 2007 as head engineer. And like most of the people in my position, I started off interning at a studio, got a job eventually at another studio, and then just kind of made enough records until people started, I hassled enough bands to make records until people started calling me to work on them. And here I am.
Yeah, that's awesome. So did you start off as a musician, or like you were in the bands and did all that beforehand?
Yeah. When I was so I've got two older brothers, and my oldest brother is a guitarist, and my next oldest brother is a bass player. So when I was a kid and trying to sort out what I wanted to do, I on the one hand, I wanted to be like my older brothers and play music. On the other hand, I didn't want to be too much like them, so I chose drums as my instrument, and have been playing that ever since. And then along the way, just kind of picking up a bunch of other instruments, just sort of mostly through studio work, actually, just by necessity.
Yeah, I think that's what happens with a lot of us. It's like, as you go along, you're like, oh, I should probably learn how to play guitar or, drums.
I'll tell you what I've gotten really good at. This is fun. I am like a badass tambourine player, because nothing is worse than sitting around in an overdub session waiting for someone to nail a tambourine part. And you just got to become the guy that can do it in one take.
That's a skill.
Not waste anyone's time. Yeah.
Yeah, same with like shakers. Shakers are the worst.
Shakers are hard, man. Yeah, that took me a little bit longer to master, but I'm pretty badass at that too. My drumming is terrible. Everything else I do is, pretty mediocre. But boy, am I good at tambourine.
Yeah. Hey, there's a market for that, right? I mean, back in the day, like with Motown, they used to always have like their percussion people who just did the tambourines and shakers.
Yeah, the tamborine's like
right?
the loudest thing in the mix on every Motown record. It's amazing.
Yeah, like the engineer must have been a tambourine player.
Right.
Everyone likes to mix their own instrument loudest in mixes, right? That's awesome. So you started off as a drummer and you got into recording. Like, what got you into recording in the first place?
So when I was a kid, my bass playing brother and I lived in the house at the same time. My oldest brother at that point had gone off to college, but my brother and I would play a lot, and my dad got us a Roland VS880 digital 8-track, which was like super duper duper state of the art, in 1996, having like a hard disk based recording system with two built-in effects. You could use two built-in effects. You could only use two, and you could only assign them to one channel each. So you had to be very frugal in your processing, but that was like pretty exceptional, and you could edit. I never learned how, because it was not screen based. It was all like command based, like a radar system kind of. But I just kind of got interested in recording, and over time found myself, I think, more interested in recording than in playing. And I was a teenage punk rocker and like kind of a scenester. And so I started kind of rounding up bands in Pittsburgh, where I went to high school, to come and record in my mom's basement with me. And I eventually got the 24-track version of the Roland VS recording system. And that was like pretty much my first foray into like a proper system and getting into it.
Totally. I can totally relate to all of that, because I started off with like a 4-track cassette deck thing, and then my next step up was the Roland VS or VS 2400, I think, which was probably the one that you got if it was 24-track version, right?
Yeah. It could, and that could actually connect to a screen, and you could use a mouse on it, so it felt a lot like a DAW. Although I didn't know that yet, because I had yet to use a DAW in my life, but I understood what it was, and that it was like what real studios had. So it kind of made me feel a little bit more sort of legit.
I totally relate to that, because we had like a local studio in our neighborhood that was kind of like the punk rock studio, and everyone would go there, and it was just in some guy's basement. And I think he had like the VS 2480, so like the next model up. But I always remembered seeing like the screens and thinking like, this is what a recording engineer looks like. They've got screens,
Right. And then you could use, there's like an EQ on every channel of that thing, which is very powerful. It's so funny. One funny anecdote about, just as a total aside, because those recordings were terrible and I had no clue what I was doing. I remember when I went to college at Berkeley for recording. So I had this particular moment where, I'd been making really pretty horrible, like objectively bad recordings for all these years through high school. And then I was taking this class at Berkeley, and we walk in and we sit down, and the teacher's got like, there's like an SSL, in the front of the room, and he's got like a tape on the, a 2-inch tape on the tape machine, and he hits play, and it sounds like ass. It's like a big band, and it's just a horrible, hollow, terrible sounding recording. And he goes, okay, I want you guys to listen and take notes and tell me what, we're going to talk about mixing. I want you to know what you think needs to be corrected on this thing, so we can get it mixed. So, we're all writing down like, the upright bass needs more 100 hertz, and, trying to be kind of like pretty clever about it, coming up with all these things. And at the end, he takes all the notes from the class, and he reads them, and it's all shit, like I said, very specific frequencies, gain, dB, all this technical stuff. And he walks over to the board, and he hits like 4 or 5 polarity buttons, rewinds the tape, and hits play again. It's like, boom, this like unbelievably massive sounding mix. And everyone's like, what'd you do? And he's like, well, that's phase, and we were all blown away. And then I sat there and went, man, that fucking little button on my Roland VS 24, whatever it was, that I had no idea I couldn't hear what it was doing when I would click it in and out when I was listening to the thing in isolation, right? Because it's polarity, right? I then went back and listened to some old like CDs that I'd made from those early years, and just hearing everything out of phase and going like, oh my God, I blew it so bad. Like the main thing that I was blowing on these old recordings was just not knowing that there's even such a thing as phase and a polarity switch on the thing to correct it.
Yeah, it's true. It's like the phase button is so important, but so many people don't know about it or why it's there. And like you said, when you're just listening to it in isolation, you're not really noticing it at all. But yeah, when you actually hear someone flip the phase for the first time, and it like starts to like rumble, and your mix sounds big and full, you're like, oh shit, that's important. I'm going to do that from now on.
Yeah, that's sort of illustrative of the difference between like having, I don't know, learning in 2021, where you can jump on like Gearspace or YouTube or something like that and find out all this information, versus 20 something years ago, where like the internet of course still existed, but the resources were like you really had to know how to go looking for that kind of stuff. And if you don't know what you don't know, you don't even really know to search for it, So yeah, it is one advantage of the modern era is just the wealth of information. Of course, that is a double-edged sword, which I'm sure I'll complain about later in this interview.
Well, and I'm sure you being a drummer, you probably tended to focus on recording drums. Maybe like that's how I felt when I first started. It's like I got to record my own instrument really well, right? So speaking of phase, it's like drums are where phase is gonna matter, right?
No one told me, and it was a disaster for all my poor. Sorry to anyone who recorded with me, between the years of in the late 90s or whatever. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I think when you're first getting started, people are a little more forgiving with it. but the thing is, you started. And that's something a lot of people don't even do, right? Like,
yeah. Most of all, I apologize to my mother for having to listen to these fucking awful rackets taking place in the basement like every weekend.
Yep. My parents would also agree with that as well, because we used to have like a really big screamo scene around here, and it was like we get all these young kids that were just, like, trying to get into it, and my mom would be like, "What the fuck are you listening to? Like, what's happening?" My parents were like totally not into the type of music that I listened to, so
that's good.
Yeah.
Well, if they were, you wouldn't have been into it. That's the thing. It's like if you put on one of those records and your mom's like, "I love this," you're going to be like, "I better find something else to listen to. Like, this is no longer cool."
Yeah, it's true. I always gravitated more to like my uncles. They were like the ones that listened to like the different things, right?
Yeah, that's the way it is for teenage boys. You don't want anything that your parents like to have any sort of impact in your life whatsoever. But uncles are totally cool.
Yeah.
Like, uncle's the guy that's going to give you a beer at a cookout or something, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my uncles were like my first concert and all that stuff. So it's like that was my initiation into real music. I felt was like, you know, my uncles were there to help to like be like, don't listen to what your parents listen to. That's garbage. Like, you know, listen to the Ramones or something like that, you know?
Right, exactly.
Awesome. So as a drummer, how would you feel like your ability to play drums has influenced the work that you've started to do later in life?
I hope to be as objective sounding as possible when I say this. I genuinely believe this is true, and this isn't just like a weird like drummer comment, but I actually think drummers usually make the best recording engineers, and maybe bass players are sort of tied for doing, you know, band oriented music. Obviously genres where there's like different, you know, stylistic concerns. Maybe it's not so important, but I think about the engineers that I know who are really good, and they're almost to a person, drummers or bass players.
Yeah, it's true. I find that like so many drummers want to become engineers, and so many engineers want to become drummers. It's just like something about it. Like I think it's like, I think with engineers, the thing that's attractive about drums is that it's like the one instrument where you get to play with so many toys at once. You know, you get to have all your mics and all your preamps and
tell that to my guitar player clients with massive pedal boards, man. Come on.
That's true too. Yeah.
I say with bass guitar though, I think bass players, good ones, you know, like, and when I say bass players, I mean people who play the bass because they want to play the bass, not like the frustrated guitarists who couldn't find a gig because there's too many guitar players, so they like learn bass. I'm talking about people who care about bass guitar.
Yeah.
They have they're uniquely well positioned a lot of times to be excellent producers because of their the kind of the way that the bass guitar marries like groove and all the harmonic kind of complexities and just sort of like, bass is one of those instruments that is like so crucial, and good bass players are so rare, and they have to know so much about like time and rhythm and groove, and then just like I said, the music theory aspect of it with understanding chord progressions and like how to kind of play melodic when the moment's right. I mean, they're really like they're the good ones are really about the song, and then so they're particularly good producers in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also think too, because the bass is it can be a hard instrument to hear in a lot of mixes. So like, I feel like the bass players that learn by ear, they're the ones that have like really trained themselves to like hone in on a specific instrument and hear like the little details in a mix to be able to learn their parts.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like that would definitely, I haven't ever thought about that. That's a really good point. But yeah, I've always just known like there's a lot of drummers.
They are. Yeah. We're everywhere, man. We're crawling all over the place.
Awesome. I'd love to shift gears and talk a little bit about your productions. And I'm curious to know, like, when you start a project, how involved do you like to get in producing a record? Like, are you getting involved in the songwriting process? Like, what's your stance there? Because I feel like the definition of a producer these days is so skewed, and there's so many different opinions.
Yeah, it is, and it is definitely super dependent on the project. Running a commercial studio and you know, having the official title of like head engineer means that people, when they reach out to me, most of the time they're trying to like book me as a recording engineer. You know, another rant that I will certainly get into later is my bands that don't have a producer or haven't thought about getting a producer or come into the studio with the assumption that the engineer is a producer. Those are all that can create a real minefield for the band. But to get back to your question, I try to clear up pretty quick when a band reaches out. whether they want me producing at all or not. And then you got to kind of have to suss out what that means. So a lot of times the band says like, no, we're going to self-produce. And maybe you got to dig a little deeper to go like, are you actually going to self-produce, or are you just not really sure what it means to have a producer and you don't want to feel like you're about to have control taken away or something like that? I mean, there's a trust building thing that kind of needs to take place. And sometimes people say we're going to self-produce and they come in and they 100% self-produce them. There's like plenty of artists I work with who are very capable producers themselves. And so you've got to sort that out. As far as what that's going to entail for me, if I am indeed producing it, it's some songwriters don't need my stupid ideas as far as the songwriting goes. Other people I have a great relationship with, and we work really well together. So it's kind of like any creative endeavor where you kind of have to find your groove with a specific person and try to fit their needs, you know, and it's genre dependent too. Like I would say if a technical metal band comes in and these guys are all playing circles around anything I could play with 1,000,000 notes per minute, I'm not going to help them with the songwriting. Like what I literally wouldn't be able to play like a measure of like any one measure of one of their songs. So what contribution can I make? What I can do is help with arrangements and structure and say like, oh, that part, maybe you need to bring that part back again, or you need a better transition here, X, Y, and Z. But I wouldn't consider that songwriting necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more arrangement.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you had mentioned going on a little bit of a rant about the producer thing. Let's do it, man. Let's hear it. What are your thoughts on it?
Okay, so yeah, I'm prone to ranting. You'll get a lot of this. I think that there's a lot of people don't understand what a producer is, what they do. A lot of producers maybe don't even understand what a producer is or what they do and how many different ways there are to do it. I'm in a pretty fortunate position here at my studio in that I work very often as producer / engineer, but I've also had a lot of really great opportunities over the years to just be the engineer under like really incredible producers, guys who've made, multi-million selling records and, just people who've like invented genres, it's pretty awesome. So they're all, these guys do things in different ways. And when you start to see all the subtleties and nuances and the impact it has on the artist, it's like almost impossible for me to like summarize it in a podcast interview. There's just like, there's so many moving parts, and it's like, you can't really understate the impact a good producer is going to have on the project. It can really be like totally transformative, even if that producer's style is kind of just sitting around and like smoking a joint on the couch in the back of the control room the whole time. Sometimes that is what the project needs. And if that's the right, if you're Rick Rubin and you're kind of just this presence that inspires people, you're doing your job. Other people are super hands-on and they're doing what you were asking about earlier, co-writing, reworking chord changes, reworking lyrics and all that stuff. And if that's what the project needs, then that person is doing a great job. So the problem is that artists, I don't think, particularly less experienced ones, those who've never worked with a proper producer, they don't even know what they're missing, right? Like, how could they? That's such a situation that's unique to professional recording studios. And if you've like never been to a professional recording studio, or if you've spent very little time in one, you just don't have any way of realizing what that sort of objective third party voice can bring to the album. I think in a lot of cases, it probably comes down to like concerns about creative control and maybe budget. Like people go like, oh, we don't want to pay even more money on this already expensive recording to someone who's a producer, not necessarily realizing that like in terms of creativity, you've got this person in your corner who can facilitate hopefully facilitate your wildest and craziest ideas that you otherwise might not be able to accomplish without him or her. And as far as the budget thing, like the amount of bands that come in and waste like massive amounts of time because nobody told them no one prepared them for the session in any number of ways. It could be they're under rehearsed, or it could be like, putting new strings on your guitar or having your guitar set up, people showing up with guitars that are poorly intonated and buzzing frets. I mean, that's stuff that any halfway decent producer would catch, on their first day of pre-production. And then to say nothing about like arrangement choices or if you're doing pre-production with the band, going to rehearsals and things and just finding problems. A super common one right off the top of my head is drummers. If you're in a recording or if you're in a rehearsal room, obviously it generally doesn't sound very good, right? Like it's loud, it's noisy, it's compromised, right? A common problem as a result of that is a bass player and a drummer, kind of at odds with each other, where the drummer is playing a kick pattern that has like nothing to do with what the bass guitar is doing, and oftentimes is in conflict with it. And if you're if I'm going and doing pre-production with a band, that's like one of the first things I'm going to listen for. And as a drummer myself, it's something that I tend to like hone in on pretty quick. And asking the drummer to change their part a month or 2 months before their recording session, and then spend the next month or two rehearsing it before they come in to record, is like a way better approach than in the session going, oh dude, your kick pattern's all wrong, can you change it? And then like all their muscle memory that they've been hopefully working on for however long is now kind of voided in a way, and so that's one example of like millions and millions of things that can just kind of be time wasters and things that end up costing the band more money, and then they achieve like kind of a lesser result.
Of course. Yeah, that's a great example. And I think that it's something that, like you said, when you're just jamming in a room, you can't hear shit. Like, it's just like, just a wash of noise, right? So it's like, you do need to sometimes just strip it down. And actually, I feel like the last couple of guests that we've had on the podcast lately have really always have been emphasizing the point of like, just rehearse acoustically, like just, or like turn the amps down like halfway, or like, something like that. Like, these kind of tips are the ways that you can like start to identify what people are doing. It could be like strumming patterns between the guitar player and the bass player, or the two guitar players are doing something completely different.
Yeah, totally different picking patterns. That's another really common one.
Yeah, but it's just so critical to getting that tightness in your recordings, to be paying attention to what's going on. So I love what you said about like the producer being that person who can help identify those things, because often people need it. It's like, maybe it's just ego or something like that. People just like think like, I know what I'm doing. Like, I'm just going to do my own thing. But it's like, sometimes you need that person to be like, no, like, let's dial this back, or let's do something a little different. Let's try something different here.
Totally. And, part of being a good producer in a way is being sensitive to that sort of reticence that an artist might have about like handing over some amount of power. And I totally get that. I mean, I've been playing in bands since I was like a young teenager and have recorded a lot of times. And I get the sort of, I don't know, the fear that you would feel about like kind of letting someone else sort of into your world and have some kind of control over what you're doing. But when you find the right person and you establish the right boundaries and things, that actually having that person becomes like massively helpful. If you can just like trust them and focus on playing really well and let them focus on what they need to focus on, and you're going to get a better result like 100% of the time. It's just not, there's a reason that all the classic records that we all love for decades and decades were made with a producer and an engineer.
Yeah, that producer is just like, they're the coach. They're the person that's going to make you a better musician at the end of this project, and make your songs better. I can even think of just as an example of, and I think I've shared this on the podcast before, but I remember like one of my bands, we were making like we had a deal with Universal and we were making our first record for that. And like, I remember our producer was just like, had a chat with the guys in my band and we're like, your drummer needs to like change everything. Like, I was just in my own world at that point. I was like, I just want to be the showboaty guy or whatever. And I remember that like he mentioned to the bands like, you might want to kick this guy out or get him to like relearn his parts. And for me, that was like such a big ego hit, but the band sat me down and they're like, hey, look, like, we're not paying attention to each other. We need to. And like, this guy's pointed out the fact that like, we're not locked. So like, let's do that. And I remember like we were doing pre-production for like 2 or 3 months, and it was like, as soon as we started just listening to each other, and it was mainly me listening to everyone else, it was like, we just became such a tighter band. And you need to have those people that are the coaches and the ones that tell you those difficult things that make your music sound better, right?
Yep. Actually, I got a great anecdote about a producer beating up on a drummer. There's a producer I did a record with last year. It's actually just come out, Ward Hayden and the Outliers. I'm actually wearing their t-shirt today, purely by coincidence. I swear this wasn't planned. The guy it's a record that I engineered for them. The producer was this guy, everyone calls him Roscoe. His name's Eric Amble, and he's a badass country and Americana guitarist and producer. He used to play with Steve Earle. I mean, the guy's like pretty legendary. He's got this great technique he was telling us about. I think he might have learned it from some producer that he was engineering for at some point, where when he's talking to a band, especially a younger, less experienced band, he'll say to the drummer, like, hey, give me a list of like 3-4 of your most influential drumming songs of all time. And then before the session at some point, he'll bring the drummer to the studio. They'll sit down and he'll hand the drummer a notebook and a pencil and say, before we play the song, how many times do you think the drummer hits a crash cymbal, and how many drum fills do you think he plays? And the drummer will write down what he thinks, and then they'll press play and he'll actually tally up the number of crash cymbals and the number of drum fills. And he says virtually every single time there's, the drummer estimates, 5 or 10 times as many crash cymbal hits and like twice the number of drum fills as there are. And it's one of those things where you go, oh, I'm so influenced by this song, and the way this drummer plays is so great, and it's everything to me. And yet you've digested it in a completely incorrect way, and you're doing it wrong, right? Like it's sort of this reality check for people to go, like, the songs that work, that you love, work because the drummer, and indeed everyone in the band, is playing for the song and not playing for their ego or because they've got some cool chops thing they want to show off. And I just love that. I think that's like it's like a non-confrontational, it's like a really brilliant non-confrontational way to sort of like set someone straight without hurting. He's not saying anything about their playing, right? That's the genius of this, is he's not saying, hey drummer, you're not going to cut it, you overplay. He's saying, let's talk about your favorite drummers and what they do and what you think they do versus the reality of what they do, and how can we kind of like find the what's actually happening, and then talk about what that means for this recording that we're about to go do. I think that is one of those hot tips, man. When Roscoe was telling me that, I'm like, that is the best thing I've ever heard in my entire life. I love that.
That's amazing. That's a great analogy. And I also think about, when I first started drumming too, it was like the same thing. I used to always I was like learning songs that I thought were just like, a good drummer is like someone who's technical or whatever. And I remember like one of my first weeks of drumming, my drum teacher was like, here's this Weezer record. Your homework is to learn every song. And I was like, every song? Like, how the fuck am I going to learn every song? And he's like, just listen. And it's like, oh, this is like simple and it works and it's huge. And so yeah, man, that's a great tip there. I think. Do you have one for guitars too? That's a solid one.
Always be tuning. Actually, I'm a tuning freak. I often end up tuning the guitars. I don't have as nearly as good of a technique for that. Oh no, here's a good one. Here's one that I came up with. This is a recent triumph of mine. This is really funny. So I was working with this artist who I was producing, and this was a situation where I was co-writing. Actually, this is a rare co-write situation for me. But so I'm like super duper involved in this project. And it's an artist who has like a pretty well established identity as like kind of a rock and roller in the vein of like Joan Jett, right? Like pretty straight ahead, like pop sensibility, but very very kind of punk but melodic, yada yada. Anyway, she's kind of retooled her sound a lot. She's gotten really inspired by like synthesizers and stuff. So we're working on this record that's like pretty synth heavy, a lot of drum programming and that kind of stuff. And she's got this friend who wants to play a solo on one of her songs, and he's like a really good guitar player, right? Like he's very capable. But I wasn't even hearing a guitar solo in the song at all. This is like this super mellow, kind of like slowish, midish tempo, like very synth heavy thing. And I'm like, there's no other guitar on this song. Like a guitar solo felt weird, but she said she'd rehearsed with him. He'd done something really cool, and I trusted her. So when he comes in to record, we get to the solo, and it turns into like I like to call it blues hammer music. Like instantly, it's like super pentatonic-y, like lots of like very guitar-y, hammer-ons, pull-offs, bending every note. Everything's got like a little run up to it. It's like way notey and way, way, way wrong for the song, right? Great solo if it was in a different type of song. Like the guy's like a killing player, but just completely the wrong thing for the music. So after I was trying to tell him to play the guitar less like a guitar, and he just wasn't. I couldn't find the language that connected with him, right? So we're going back and forth, and he keeps playing stuff, and it's like I'm not expressing myself in a way that is clear to him. He's not playing in a way that works for me or for the song, for the artist. So we're kind of at this impasse. And I'm like, here's the thing. It's like a 32 bar solo. And I was like, you have 10 notes. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, I'm going to hold up my hands, indicating my 10 fingers. And every time you play a note, I'm going to do a countdown. And if you run out of notes before the end of the solo, I'm going to press stop and we're going to wind it back and start it over again. And of course, needless to say, the first time we did it, he played 10 notes in about 2 measures. And I hit stop. I'm like, yep, taking it again. And I sat there and I'm like counting down, like right in his face, just counting down his number of notes. And after a few takes of it, he started playing these like brilliant, like Mark Ribot style or like Mark Knopfler style, just like wicked spacious, awesome solo. And we like kind of honed it down. I think we ended up with like 7 or 8 notes at the end of it. Like he actually managed to come in like under budget.
Nice.
And it was great. And it was also just a real delight standing in front of this guy going like this. I'm counting down my fingers for the people listening at home. I'm demonstrating on the Zoom call here. But anyway, that was awesome. It was really fun. So that's one. Just get like some kind of counting device, whether it's your hands or something visual, and you can just count down notes while someone's playing.
That's an amazing tip. I like that a lot. I'm 100% going to use that at some point.
It was truly one of my proudest moments. I was like, that was awesome.
Well, and also just like, people sometimes need to be like forced out of their element and if they're used to overplaying, then they need to have someone who puts those constraints on them, and then it forces them to think a little differently and probably like more just emotionally or whatever through their instrument, as opposed to just being the technical virtuoso and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I think one thing with guitarists, soloists in particular, is that's really like a challenging thing to overcome is guitarists in particular often tend to rely on like licks, right? Like they've got muscle memory for certain like short musical ideas and they string them together into a solo. And when you get into that, which everyone does, it's of course it's part of why we practice, right? To like be able to play these things on command. But what people start to do is they string together licks that then become longer licks, and then they fall into these like same sort of patterns, right? So another cool way to break that habit, and this is something that happened. I was doing this by accident, and it was a guitar player I work with who told me afterwards that it was really helpful for him, and I wasn't trying to be helpful for him. I was just trying to get a take, but. What happened was this guy I work with, he's like a phenomenal guitar player. Like he can play every Eddie Van Halen solo in his sleep, like Chops master. And we were doing solos and he does every take a little bit differently and they're all genius. But then I would go through and comp and I would pick all my favorite parts. And I was just picking my favorite parts to pick my favorite parts. I just wanted like a badass solo. And when I put it all together and play it back for him, turns out I was breaking his licks habit, right? Like he would usually string like, it would go like lick A to B to C, and I would grab like lick D and put it in the middle somewhere. And that's a thing that he would never have played naturally. And then he went back and relearned all the solos as they were edited for the record. And that's when he came back to me and he's like, dude, I've got like a whole new bag of tricks now because of the way you comped the guitar solo. Like, thank you so much. I'm like, I wish I could say that was by design. Now it is. Now I actually make a point to do this. But this first time, it was one of those accidents, happy accidents of the studio where you're just kind of like doing your thing and then you realize like, I've actually stumbled upon something really cool here. This is a good technique, which is to take all these cool parts and just reorganize them and then play them back. And now you've got something that is different from what that person normally would have done. And then, if you're doing it on the fly, now that I do this as like a regular technique, I'll do that, play it back for the guitarist and then go like, now play something like this. And it kind of temporarily breaks their brain a little bit, and they start to produce solos that are not the same thing they always do every time. I should add a caveat that the guitar player needs to be pretty darn good to use this technique. Like they've got to be capable enough that they're not gonna panic when you say like now do something like this. Not everyone has that level of ability. But when they do, it's a really powerful tool for kind of getting people out of a rut, especially if you're working on a record with lots of guitar solos on it and you start to feel like, man, I've heard that lick like 10 times already, Yeah,
that's great. Another great tip there. Yeah, I remember I had a long time ago on my podcast, I had James Paul Wisner, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he did like some of the early Dashboard Confessional records and stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure it was him that said this. But he whoever it was, I'm pretty certain it was him, said that even with singers too, like oftentimes, like, you know, you go through the same vocal part over and over again, and if people are having a hard time nailing their parts, sometimes his approach was like, he would just get them to do a take where it was like, sing everything wrong, like just sing it like just completely different, don't follow like the same rhythm or whatever, just like do something completely different. And he would often record that take, and it was just like, sometimes there was gold in that take, you know, just because they had never thought of it differently. But it was like a technique that would help you kind of recenter, and like you kind of forgot about all those mistakes you were making, because now you've just had to make a billion different mistakes for like the exercise. So it's just like another like really cool tip for vocals and helping people reset there, but also capturing some really cool ideas too. Like, you know, it's kind of like your guitar solo thing.
Totally. Yeah, and with something like the vocals too, that's probably a really good way to start generating ideas for harmony vocals or something. Because if they're still singing in key and to the, you know, to the chord changes of the song, but just they're not singing that original melody, if you lay that against what the original melody is, you're going to start to go like, oh, there's a harmony part, right? You can start to build off of that. That's cool.
Yeah. Man, this is like a great little chunk of the podcast here. I think, you know, this is helpful, because like these are the things that so many people don't even think about, and it can really like change the course of your recordings and make things often better, you know? Right. So,
yeah, I mean, this is just to try to bring it back to what started this whole thing in the first place. This little exchange of anecdotes and stuff is exactly speaks to the idea of like why producers can be so beneficial, because experienced producers have, you know, you and I could probably talk about, we could come up with all these different tricks we've heard through the years for hours, right? And still only scratch the surface of the stuff that we've done and known. And, you know, people who've been around even longer than me or you have that many more tips and tricks to share. And so when you are working with someone who's experienced, they're bringing all that background and experience into the studio. You're gaining the benefit. If you're in the studio for the first time as a musician, you are gaining the benefit of someone who's done it like hundreds or thousands of times before. Why wouldn't you want that? It on its face, it seems so obvious, but it is so often overlooked.
Of course. And I think anyone who's also getting into engineering should be like, even if you're going to record your own record, it's a good idea sometimes to just hire a producer, just to like have that other third party, you know, like you'll learn a lot just by, you know, all these kind of tips and stuff that you're going to see someone else implement in your own sessions. You're like, oh, I should try that next time. Or like, that works for me, you know?
Along those lines, when any of my bands record, I never, ever produce my own drum tracks, ever. I won't do it. I don't see it's such a bad idea to self-produce in most cases. And to self-engineer. Like, I guess I would say I would co-produce my drum tracks 100% of the time. I will hire an engineer to record them for me, because you're not gonna be working at your best if you're trying to split your brain up between all these different processes. Another along the same lines, actually, I was just having this conversation with, I have an intern who's since become our second engineer here. And he's really good. And he's, through a conversation I had with him, and then a conversation I had with another client who I mix for, who is also a recording engineer, just this kind of confluence of events took place where I've got I had this realization that if I could kind of go back in time and like change one thing about earlier stages of my career, it's that I wish when I was much less experienced mixer, and I was just kind of starting to get my head wrapped around like how to be a halfway decent recording engineer, I wish that more records that I was working on had been farmed out to someone else to mix, rather than having me mix them, because they would have come out way better, and I would have had a far superior sounding body of work to play, not as a mixer, but as an engineer and occasionally as a producer. I was doing some producing back then as well. And I kind of like listen back to some of my earlier work and go like, man, this is a great band. I did a good recording, and I'm really proud of the way I produced it, but the mix is like definitely not as good as it could have been, you know? And I think that's a drag. It's a drag for me in terms of just thinking back on, you know, different directions my career may have gone. And it's also a drag for the band, who, like, you know, deserves the best in my opinion. So I was expressing that to this intern turned second engineer I have, saying like, listen, man, if you know a lot of people who are like way better at mixing than you, you're doing a great job producing these bands here in town. I'm like, it makes so much sense for you to like farm some of this mix work out to people more experienced than you. It's gonna make you look better at the end of the day. You know, it's gonna bring the most out of your productions and out of your engineering tracks. And there's nothing that stops you from still practicing. You can still mix the track, right? Like it isn't necessarily what gets released, but there's nothing stopping you from still working on it. So you still gain the benefit of the practice of having mixed the album. You know, that is one of those things that if I could go back in time and change for myself, I would change. I hope that that second engineer of mine takes that sort of to heart. And one particular, the reason that it came up is because there's a client I have who records himself, and I've been mixing a bunch of stuff for his band, but he's gotten really into recording. He's actually annoyingly good at it for how young he is. But you know, he's not you know, for his age and experience level, he's a pretty good mixer, but he's not like, you know, frankly, he's not very good. And he actually there's a band, kind of a prominent band that he's working with that he's, you know, hired the band hired another mixer to work on it, and it sounds like freaking awesome. And I'm like, dude, your name is now associated with this like really, really good sounding record, you know? And it's like, you couldn't have accomplished that if you'd have mixed it yourself. And I get that it's disappointing to not be the mixer, especially nowadays, because the role of mixer has become like weirdly glamorized. But as I talked to the guy whose podcast is called MasterYourMix, I'm sorry. But anyway, it's like there's like this whole celebrity mixer trend has kind of created this this thing about, you know, mixers are like the coolest guy in the process, you know. And so I understand why people want to mix their own tracks, but you know, if you're thinking in terms of like what's best for the music, and if you're younger and less experienced, what's the best course to take for your career? The best course is the best possible product 100% of the time. And until you're the mixer who can deliver that, it is probably not best that you mix the stuff.
That's huge advice. I think that's what people do need to hear, because it's so true. It's like, I feel that a lot of us get into this because we want that level of control with our music. You know, it's like, I just want to be able to record it all myself. I want to have a creative vision. I just want to be really good at all this stuff. But you're absolutely right that sometimes there is a need to just farm out and get someone else who's way more experienced at it. And I think that even for mixing engineers, you can learn those same sort of lessons by hiring a mastering engineer. You know, it's like along those chains of like, there's always people that are like helping each other learn where the potential in their mixes are. So yeah, man, I think that's a great point that, you know, people just need to, you could probably advance your name much faster when you're working with like a good team of people rather than trying to take all the credit and working at it slowly. Right.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the huge, excellent sounding and influential records of, you know, music throughout musical history, there's like truly almost none that were made by one person, like who is both acting as artist, producer, and then also as engineer and mixer. There's like, that's virtually unheard of, you know? I mean, you've got like your occasional, like Imogen Heaps who or like Swift John Stevens, like these people who are like so fabulously and extraordinarily talented to like the mutant level of skill. But, you know, I know it's not a great, very inspiring thing to say, but like virtually no one is that good. You know, most people do their best work when they find the right team and they specialize at what they're best at. And collaboration is pretty crucial to like getting the best results.
Of course. Yeah. At the end of the day, the whole point of this is to just make the best sounding music out there and, you know, serve the song, serve the artist, you know, and grow your career. Like, we're all in this together as a team. Like that's our job, is to help people get to that next level. As far as like, you know, putting in all of this work and hiring a producer and everything we just talked about, all these tips of like, you know, ways to make people play better and serve the song a little bit better. What would you say, in your opinion, makes a good song?
That's such a hard question. It's definitely genre dependent, right? Like there's different criteria, I think, for different genres. But I guess the one truism, and it's almost too obvious to even say. Like, it sounds kind of corny, but it's just got to connect to the listener. But how it connects to the listener and exactly what that means, I think, is going to depend on so much. Like, does a dubstep track have the same criteria for connecting to a listener as a punk rock song? Of course not. The dubstep audience is having a great time at a music festival high on drugs, and they want big ass bass and drops and kind of just like something that is fun to dance to. And the angsty 15-year-old Benny Grotto wants to listen to a song about how the cops suck. You know what I mean? Like, they're just completely different criteria, but at the end of the day, they're connecting with the listener in whatever way that is. So, I don't know. There's no right answer to that song. Yeah. Or to that question rather. It varies by song and genre and all, and by individual, by the listener.
Yeah, totally. I 100% agree with that. Every genre is different. And you mentioned something that kind of tied into a question I wanted to ask you about. You mentioned like kind of the dubstep and how, everything's all about just like getting the massive low end and all that stuff. And one thing that I really like about your mixes is that I feel like you always have this like massive low end. Like, to me, your mixes sound heavy, they sound full, and that's definitely a challenging thing, especially in a lot of rock music. I find a lot of people have a really hard time with like getting that low end, getting the kick and bass balance, all that kind of stuff. So I'm curious to know, like, do you have any tips for getting that low end so locked in?
Good monitoring helps. That's like a rote answer, but it's true. You can't. It's tough to hear what you're doing down there if you can't hear it. But I don't know. I think I know it's so hard for me to talk about my mixes in this way because I am pretty uniformly mortified by the way everything I work on sounds when I'm finished with it. So it's hard for me to go like, yeah, that sounded good. I can tell you how I did it. And most of the time I'm just like, oh man, I hope no one realizes that this is terrible, but I think that I take a lot of care when I'm mixing to like, present it. But better way to put it, I don't like to rely on the mastering for anything, right? Much to the chagrin of some of my mastering engineers that I use, where I send them, loud, heavily processed 2 tracks. Most of the time, there's been very few complaints, but I'm sure I'm making some people roll their eyes from time to time with that stuff. I think that like managing the dynamics of the song is really important, and that means whether it means compression and limiting or like lots of fader rides or something. I think managing that stuff as you're mixing is really important. And I think that tends to translate to a more sort of stable, whether it's stable low end or mid range or whatever. You're not giving the mastering engineer a situation where they've got to do a bunch of stuff that's going to change the balances or change the interaction of the parts, right? Like if you're working on a metal record and it's got 10 dB of headroom, you've got these big giant transients, and the band is then telling the master engineer, we want it to be like -6, like we want it really loud. The way to accomplish that for the master engineer is going to be to like cream it, clip it, limit it, compress it, do all kinds of wacky stuff, and then at the end of the mastering, it's not going to sound anything like the mix anymore. So no matter how much you nailed stuff in that mix, all that kind of goes out the window. So I think if anything, if there's like if there's something good that I'm doing, it's probably just trying to make it sound finished from as early a stage as possible. That actually extends all the way down to tracking, I would add. I mean, I'm usually trying to record the sounds that I want to hear. I actually don't like mixing very much. I kind of find it stressful. And I really like recording and I really like producing. So I try to make the mixing process as painless as possible for myself by like committing to decisions and getting as specific as I can with the tones that I'm capturing. That's
a great point. But it's all it's all like, what's the word? Like every stage kind of sets the stage for the next one, you know? So you have to have great recordings in order to then make the editing process smoother, and then make the mixing process smoother, and then make the mastering process smoother. It's like all of those things need to kind of piggyback on top of each other. So you can't really drop the ball in any of those stages. Otherwise you're kind of working from a bit of a loss, so to speak, like by the time you get to the next stage. So yeah, I think, it's super important to definitely get your track sounding as close as you can to the final product at every stage of the process.
Yeah, and I would, in addition to just sort of like objective quality, obviously you need high objective quality at the beginning to achieve it at the end. But I would say, like, my kind of producer brain says, if I am working on a tune, just as an example, like if it's a song that needs like really bright and really ambient drums, we'll say, and typically that would mean like adding a bunch of high frequencies and compressing the shit out of the room mics, right? Just for, if anyone's not sure how to accomplish that, that's how you do it. So if that's the sound I need, but I think to myself, well, I don't want to overcook something, so I'm going to wait till I'm mixing before I add the high frequencies and compress the shit out of the room mics. Every time you add another sound, like as you're overdubbing bass, guitars, whatever, you're probably gonna have tracks that are like overly dynamic and not bright enough. Meaning you have this opportunity when you're, say, cutting guitars to like, maybe you gotta like brighten up the tone on the amp a little bit to match what you're going to eventually do with the drums when you mix. And if you don't do that, you end up with the wrong sound, and then you've got this whole conundrum when you're mixing to try to make it all work. Versus if you just make the drums bright and compressed and loud when you're tracking, then every time you overdub something, your subsequent tonal decisions on the other parts of the arrangement will be informed by what you've already captured. And that means you're going to hear the context, this brighter drum sound that's going to make you go like, oh, actually the guitars need to be brighter too. And you're going to kind of build everything up according to that and end up with a far better sounding and much easier to mix end result.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I really like that idea of just, getting it right and then building on top. Because yeah, you're right. It does inform every decision you make. And if everything is sounding dark to begin with, you're probably going to end up with darker sounding tracks. And, as you're piggybacking, and then in the mix, you're going to be like, oh shit, like this is nowhere near where it needs to be.
Right. Have you ever, I'm sure this has happened to you, and probably it's happened to a lot of your listeners too. It's a pretty common one, is that you are sitting down to start mixing a song, and you like a lot of people, I often start with drums. You put up your snare fader and you're like, man, I really gotta, like, the snare is pretty fat sounding, but it needs to be way brighter. So you make it way brighter, and then all of a sudden you have all this like insane hi-hat bleed, right? That happens so often. If the tracking engineer had gone, man, I bet the snare is going to need to be way brighter on this, this rock band that wishes they could afford Chris Lord-Alge to mix, I better make the snare really bright. And they added that at the desk or, whatever, at their channel strip when they were recording it. All of a sudden they're going to go, oh shit, now the hi-hat bleed's coming through. Let me go move the mic a little bit to dial back some of the hi-hat bleed. And now all of a sudden you've got less hi-hat bleed and a brighter sound. You've done so much more than is possible to do with the mix, short of like a sample replacement. Because if you put a gate on there, you're going to get that little burst of cymbal bleed every time the snare hits, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe you got to tune the drum a little bit differently. I mean, you have so much more. The earlier in the process you go, you have so much more flexibility in what you can do to change the tone, and that that kind of carries on right through to mastering. The further you get into the process, there's less you can do. Your options get increasingly limited, and so exploring those sounds as specific a way as possible is like hugely important to a successful production, I think. Just because context is everything. That's, mixing is all about balancing, and balancing is like all about context.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great example with the snare hi-hat thing, because it's so true. It's like, that is a quick, easy way to know whether you've got the right mic positioning or if you have to do something different with it. So yeah, that's a really great tip. Which actually ties into another question that I wanted to ask you about, which is that another element of your mixes that I really like the sound of is your snare tones. Like, to me, like, good. I mean, to me, now that I know you're a drummer, it makes total sense, because I feel like when I listen to your snare tones, they sound like a snare drum. They have a lot of body to them. They sound nice and full. And I don't know, like to me, like maybe it's just me being a drummer. Like I find snare to be the hardest thing to mix. Like I hate mixing snares for whatever reason. I feel like they need to have so much like character to them. I don't know what, like maybe that's just my own drummer way of thinking of it, you know?
It's funny because to me the easiest part of the drum kit is the snare drum. I always know what I want to do with the snare, and it's like if I would like to like walk you into my live rooms right behind the computer here, I could show you my embarrassingly large collection of snare drums. I'm like a snare freak. I love drums. I love owning them, and I love having lots of them. Excuse me. But to me the snare drum's so easy. It's like I don't. It's like one of the few parts of mixing where I'm like, I know what I'm doing. Yeah, and I like them really bright. Like I basically like to get them as bright and as fat as possible. And I think that's pretty easy to achieve. You just kind of like turn up the high frequency until it hurts, and then you turn it down a little bit, and then you turn up the bottom end until it sounds stupid and woofy, and then you turn it down a little bit, and like you compress the shit out of it. And like sometimes you have to like I don't know, distortion or clipping is like pretty great sounding on snare drums. So if you obviously depends on the style and stuff. Like you not everything needs to be the big bright loud front of the mix snare, but even like a more mellow, like darker, like fat kind of dry snare sound is, benefits from a little bit of clipping. You put it this way, snare drums sound really good coming off a tape. And tape is a clipper, more or less. It's a particular type of clipper. It shaves off the high. The high end tends to distort a little bit before the low end on tape, and so I don't know. Using that principle, it's pretty easy to like work on snare sounds. Just make them bright, and then like I can tell you, I EQ before the compression almost 100% of the time on snare drums. That definitely helps because as you compress the snare, you bring out all the boxy mid-range weirdness, right? So if you hype up the top and the bottom and kind of do some shaping, the compressor will respond a little bit more in a more flattering way. And then maybe afterwards, you might have to suck out some individual resonances if they're there. But again, that kind of takes us back to the whole tracking question, which is like choosing the right snare and with the proper amount of dampening and that kind of thing. If you're tracking your snare with a little bit of EQ and a little bit of compression, that's going to tell you a whole lot about whether you need another piece of moon gel or like a snare weight or one of those, big fat O-ring, whatever they're called.
Yeah, the big fat snare drum.
Big fat snare. Yeah. Any of that, that's why you start to make some decisions when you're tracking so that you can then go back into the live room and make some adjustments to the drum itself, loosen the snares. I think tuning, like, I don't know. I could count on one hand, maybe at this point more than one hand, but drummers don't know how to tune drums almost to a person, right? Like luckily I'm a drummer, so I'm passionate about drum tuning, but it's really infrequent that the drummer just tunes their own kit and does a good job at it when I'm recording bands. It's almost always I have to go in there and do it, which is fine. I don't dislike it, but it's like, it eats up time and it takes a little bit of the tonal sort of control away from the drummer, which is a bit of a bummer, just like philosophically. But anyway, that's the I don't know. It's funny that you bring that up about the snare drums being so difficult, because to me, it's really kind of, those are the things that I just that seems like so easy to me.
and maybe the solution really lies in the fact that you do have such a massive snare collection and you're getting the right tone to begin with, right? Like,
yeah.
But I also think that it's interesting that it goes back to what you said about like kind of just adding the EQ very early on, but it's like a large part of your snare sound seems to be coming from all of that pre-processing before it's actually being thrown into the DAW.
Yeah. And it's like another little side too, I guess it's maybe worth, because we're kind of talking about snare close mics a lot in this conversation, and I think there's a lot of it overlooks a massive part of the sound of the snare drum, which is the overheads and the room mics, and any sort of I usually end up with at least one kind of like fun mic on the drum kit where I just stick it somewhere weird and distort it, or I put it somewhere totally weird and, well, usually I distort it. But I like to have some I like to have some kind of sort of like an X. I call it the X mic. On my Pro Tools session, I usually label it X, and it's just the one that I put somewhere funny. And blending in a little bit of that can bring kind of an interesting, strange dimension that adds a little bit of extra character or detail. But then, you thinking about how you treat the overheads and how you treat the room, and especially on a rock drum kit where a lot of the sound is actually from the punch is coming from the close mics, but the tone is like a lot of it has to do with the room, Like if any of you guys, or if you or any of the listeners have ever checked out like the Chris Lord Algae, Stephen Slate, like snare samples, they're like kind of shocking sounding, right? They are like carved out. They do like a couple really specific things, and this is something that Chris is a master at. Is they do something very particular in the low end, they do something very particular in the high end, and then there's like some piece of the mid range, and everything that isn't necessary is gone. But then you listen to the ambient samples, and it sounds like a drum in a room again. It's like, I think a similar approach is advisable, right? Like, let your snare close mics, like snare drums don't sound like snare drums when there's a SM57 an inch away from them, right? Like, no one hears the snare drum that way. So you use that source for like really specific things, attack, body, whatever. It could be both. It could be neither. It's like pretty dependent on the song. And then in order to make it sound actually like a snare drum again, you've got to maybe do something with the ambient mic treatments or the overheads or something like that. Actually, here's a funny producer anecdote is I was doing a track with Jack Douglas, who's like a pretty legendary 70s rock producer, 70s and beyond. He's been keeping busy for a long time, but he's like, he did like the first couple Aerosmith records and Kiss and like Cheap Trick. The guy, he like signed Alice Cooper and shit. He's like, pretty incredible career this guy had. So I was mixing a song that they tracked the drums at another studio, and then we did some overdubs like vocals and guitars here at my studio, and then I was mixing it. And as I was working on the snare close mic, Jack actually said something to the effect of like, dude, make sure it still sounds like a snare. And I'm like, it will. Like, I know what I'm doing is very extreme right now, but it's gonna, when I put the thing all together, it'll make more sense. And I unsoloed the snare, and he's like, oh, okay, I get it now. Cause it's sometimes what you're doing to those close mics is like really kind of weird sounding.
It's true.
And
they just don't sound like that up close. They
don't sound like that up close. Yeah. And I don't see any particular reason to try to honor like any kind of like, faithful, I don't know, like honesty in sound when you're micing something from an inch away where no one ever hears it. Why give a damn about whether that's faithful to the source, right? Do whatever it needs to be done. And then, let the big picture be the thing that maybe faithfully recreates the specific tone that you have or that you have in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that kind of introduces another topic too, which is like the topic of overheads and room mics. And I know a lot of people think of overheads as these cymbal mics. There's kind of those two schools of thoughts. There's people that are like cymbal mics, that's the way I do it, or there's like the big picture kit kind of people. Sounds like you're more of the big picture kit kind of person.
It's pretty dependent. This is my broken record thing, is I'm always, it totally depends, That's true with overheads too, though. So if I'm working on like a really technical metal record in my room specifically, my room has it's like a really big low end, which is rad when you're doing like mid-tempo or slower rock tunes. Like the kick drum just sounds huge, the toms sound huge. But if you've got a drummer in with a lot of double kick and a lot of really fast, intricate tom work, that boominess actually becomes a problem, right? That's gonna cloud up the clarity pretty fast. So in those cases, I would treat the overheads more like cymbal mics, and I'd filter out a bunch of low end from the overheads. But if I'm in here doing a record that's, like I said, more kind of in a classic rock type of vibe, or if it's slower mid tempo, I would be more inclined to use the overheads to capture the whole kit, unless the drummer sucks, and then that changes everything. Or even if the drummer is okay but is dynamically inconsistent. Like one of the hardest, like one of the difficulties of mixing drums is just I don't think a lot of drummers are putting as much thought as they ought to into like the dynamic consistency or just their dynamics in general. Like if the drummer's a cymbal basher, you have no choice but to use your overheads as cymbal mics. That's just what they're just going to be that, right? But if you have a really good drummer who plays the kit really well, in terms of the internal balance, then you have a lot more. You can choose the best option as opposed to kind of having your hand forced. And then it kind of gets back to that question about like, what does the song or the genre call for, you know? On the other hand, if the drummer's got good internal dynamics overall, but sometimes just like hits the snare way too hard, or hits, you know, they're not necessarily consistent, I should say, whether they're always gonna be hitting something or other too hard or too soft, you're kind of gonna have to reconsider how you use those mics, right? Like, your tones are gonna change a lot. If you get something rocking and sounding really good for one section, and then in the next session, all of a sudden the guy's like nailing the snare drum, your snare sound's going to change, right? And probably not for the better if you've got everything really dialed in the previous section. So then you've got to start to think about, can I use the overheads for part of the snare sound? Now all of a sudden the snare sounds like maybe boxy, or there's too much ambient information on it, and it's not sitting correctly anymore. So it's, maybe you're filtering the overheads, maybe you're putting a limiter on the overheads to knock the snare down. Any of those techniques would work. But it's all kind of going to come down to the drummer and the song and the style.
Yeah, of course. And you also bring up kind of a good point, too, of the different types of drummers. And, you know, in particular, I think like the bashers are like, you know, we hear a lot of rock music that sounds, you know, so over the top, and the snare drums sound like cannons and whatever. And so like, I think a lot of people think that they have to beat the shit out of their drums to get them to sound as heavy. But sometimes like you do need to tell people just like ease off a little bit, because then you're not choking the cymbals as much, or you're not digging into the skin and choking the snare a little bit more. You get more body off the drums that way, you know? So yeah, it really does come down to the drummer and kind of sometimes telling them to reel it in a little bit to get that controlled sound that you can work with.
And I think beyond, I mean, you know, a drum that's hit really hard has a particular type of sound that can be good or bad. And just as a drum that's hit quietly can have a sound that's good or bad. But I think what's important is, first for session drumming, at least like studio drumming, is consistency. If you're in a band that calls for like really hard hit drums, but you're maybe physically not capable, I would fall into that category, by the way. I am not like a very muscular drummer. If I record a drummer who can't hit very hard but hits really consistent, I can do all kinds of things to make it sound like they're nailing those drums, as long as they're consistent, right? Because the processing that you do, especially when it's dynamics dependent, is going to fall apart when the dynamic changes, right? So sort of on a very related note, I used to tour with this old Boston kind of like sort of legendary hardcore band called Slapshot. They've been around since the 80s, and I did a record for them, and then the drummer that was on that record left the band and they had a tour booked. I knew all the new songs because I just produced a record for them, so I went and joined the tour and then played in the band for a few years. And the drummer they had before me, really big dude, hit the shit out of the drums, man. He was like just a savage drummer. But over the course of a given set, he'd play quieter and quieter and quieter as he got more and more tired, right? Like the set that the band played was long. It was like, you know, 25, 30 songs of like really fast hardcore. So it was like very physically demanding. And I'm a pretty efficient drummer. So I would just go in, I'd play like medium dynamic, just so that I could keep it even the whole way through. And the shows would sound awesome because it was, you know, I'm not nailing the drums, but the sound guy would dial in a compressor and he would dial in whatever EQ he had to do. And that sound, he made it sound like I was hitting the drums really hard, and then it would stay consistent the whole set. And so the live sound was really good as a result. And it's a similar concept in the studio, where if someone comes in and goes, yeah, man, I'm a badass, super hard hitting drummer. It's like, cool. You were for the first 5 takes of the song. Now from takes like 6 to 10, things are starting to wane. And when I comp, it's a complete nightmare, you know? Not to mention your drum heads are worn, and we need to spend $150 to rehead your kit.
Yeah, everything's out of tune now. And also,
yeah.
Lugs are just falling off.
Totally.
That's such a common thing.
It's like the consistency thing is critical. I mean, like I said, I'd rather have someone who doesn't hit hard enough but stays at the same dynamic for the full recording than someone who's going to come in and like most of the time be hitting hard, but every now and then or they either lose steam or every now and then they just kind of like lose energy, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Well, one other question that I wanted to ask you about your productions is, I have to ask about this. I saw you worked with Weird Al.
I did.
And
highlight of my life.
Yeah, and that's amazing, man. Like his Bad Hair Day album, like that was like my first cassette ever.
Yeah, awesome.
So yeah, I'm just curious to know. Like I saw you were the vocal engineer for his latest records, and I'm just curious to know what the process of recording his vocals is like. Are you like auditioning different types of mics to try to emulate the songs that he's parodying, or like what does that normally look like?
So with that record, I actually didn't record Al. I recorded Amanda Palmer, who's a friend of Al's and a client of mine. She's singing. There's a song on there that's like a Pixies style. It's not a direct parody of any specific Pixies song, but it is in the style of the Pixies. And so he's singing the Frank Black parts, and she's singing the Kim Deal parts. So Al actually produced the session via Skype, but the actual vocal record that I was recording, the vocalist I was recording was Amanda Palmer.
Gotcha. Yeah. I just assumed that like, there must be like an art to just producing that kind of stuff and like getting the right sounds with working with them.
The raw tracks were awesome. They'd sent me the tracks to cut Amanda's vocals to, and I got stems. I got like a stereo drum stem and a bass and a stereo guitar stem, and they like nailed the sound of all those tracks. It was pretty cool. But his band is awesome. I don't know if you've ever seen them live, but man, his band, like what they do is remarkable. On like super quick. They're not spending all this time between songs like dialing in gear or anything like that. They just go song to song to song, and they like on a dime. They nail the styles. They nail the tones. It's really, really exceptional. That band that's like a killing band.
Yeah, for sure. And it's one of those things that I think a lot of people don't suspect, because it's like they're known for, like Weird Al's known for being jokey and this and that. So you think like, oh, they don't take it very serious. But it's like that I know that band is like incredible, and like they are insanely good, and like especially when it comes to like the polka stuff, and like they're so talented. So yeah, that's awesome, man. Well, yeah, I was just curious to hear what it was like to work with him, and sounds like, if I'm assuming like he was producing it, you said, right? So
yeah, yep.
So yeah, you probably learned some tricks from Weird Al.
Yeah, he's so kind. I'm like the biggest Weird Al evangelist now, because just like on like a professional level, the way he treats people is so cool, and how they came through on a tour after we did that session. It was about a year after the session, actually, because the cycle for the album takes a while for it to come out and all that. And I met up with it. Like we went like hung out at his hotel and stuff like that. Like he invited me to hang out in his in his hotel room. I was like, dude, that is cool. And I at the time I had a girlfriend who was a comedy writer, and she just gotten her first book deal, and he's like, bring her along. And he was like giving her all kinds of tips about like, comedy writing and how to like kind of steer her career. I mean, the dude's just like, the guy's a completely awesome dude. He's a legend. Yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool, man. Well, yeah, we can start to wrap up here. Like, I just wanted to know about Weird Al. It was great. So yeah, we'll start to wrap up. But I'm just curious, like, if anyone wants to learn more about you and follow you online and kind of learn more about the projects that you're working on, what's the best way for them to do that?
Probably on Instagram. I gotta look up to see what the handle is. I'm not like a massive social media user, but I do have a studio account and a personal account for the Instagram. What do we got here? Oh, it's benny.grotto for Instagram. BENNY .GROTTO. And then the studio account is Mad Oak Studios. That's plural. It's written out as one word. And I'm now just noticing the Mad Oak Studios avatar, like profile pic, is a picture of my cat, which is funny. I put that in there as a placeholder for something and evidently forgot to change it. So you can check out my very adorable Maine Coon. His name is Gus. at Mad Oak Studios on Instagram.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, lastly, are there any cool projects that you're currently working on that you can talk about?
Yeah, totally. I had a crazy week last week, actually. This is funny timing. So this is one of those things where you never really know like what's going to come up, right? I had supposed to start an album that I've been hired to produce. I was supposed to start it last week. And that's actually one of the things I'm really looking forward to is this kind of legendary post-hardcore band called Super Touch. And this record is like so awesome. I've actually doing a little co-writing on that one as well. But the singer was having like a voice issue. And so he canceled, which was a big bummer because I was looking forward to getting started. And that very day I got a call to do a little short, mixing session for the Rolling Stones, which is a completely insane left turn that, I'm still sort of like, how did that happen? That's wild. So I did that. That was pretty rad. I've got this Super Touch record I'm working on that's really cool. There's a really excellent young artist called Francis Forever who rose to some prominence via TikTok. I've been working with them a bunch. Another TikTok artist who I've got a session with coming up, probably will have happened by the time this podcast comes out, I imagine, is an artist called Margot Bailey. Maybe Bailey, I'm actually not 100% sure, but she's French, so I'm thinking it's Bailey. She's got like almost 2 million followers on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. That is a world that is so foreign to me, but I'm happy that they're finding the studio, and her music's really good too. She's like a kind of a folky songwriter artist. She's really good. And then there's a artist, Boston-based artist named Chrissa Johnson. That's actually the artist I was working with when I was telling you about that guitar solo that I was counting down for. She's got a series of singles that have been coming out over the last like couple months. I think the full album comes out in November. But she is so freaking good, and I can't quite wrap my head around why she isn't famous yet. She's one of those people where you're like, she should be like known by a lot more people than she's known by. So that's a record I'm really proud of that I recently worked on as well. Amazing.
Well, man, I got to check it out then. Sounds awesome.
Yeah, she's great. She tours a lot too, so she'll be plenty visible.
Awesome. Cool, man. Well, Benny, thanks again for taking the time to do this.
Yeah,
really
my pleasure.
Appreciate it. Yeah, man, like so many great tips in here, and I think that anyone who's ever gone through that experience of struggling to like communicate with an artist or like get them to like simplify their parts and that kind of stuff, like just really serving the song. I think you gave us so many great tips that people can definitely use and implement right away. I know I'm definitely going to be taking that 10 finger thing.
Oh yeah, please make it known. It's like my best contribution to the advancement of the art.
So that was my interview with Benny Grotto, and there were so many great tips that he shared there. I love his approach to coaching musicians, and I love the tip that he shared about, trying to get people to simplify their guitar solos so that they can serve the song better, and that whole 10-finger technique. It's so good. I'm definitely going to be using that in a session at some point or another, because sometimes you just need to be tactful with the way you coach people through their performances. You don't want to just be telling people their performance is no good, or that they're overplaying it, or, like anything that might offend someone. So I love that approach that Benny gave, because it sets the constraints on someone, but without it being a jerkish way to do it. Instead, it just kind of makes it a little bit more of a fun exercise, snaps people out of it, and, gets them out of their heads a little bit. And, that exercise combined with the one that he shared about the drummers and asking people to identify how many fills there are in a song normally with their favorite artists, I think that's also a really good reality check that isn't an offensive way to tell people like, okay, let's simplify this, let's dial this back a little bit. So yeah, some great tips here. And I totally agree with everything that Benny was saying in this podcast about working with producers and how you can just learn so much when you have an experienced person in the room. And that applies whether you're working with a producer or you're hiring someone to help you with mixing or mastering. All of these things, you can learn so much from other people. So with that said, I hope that you really enjoyed this episode. And if you did, definitely make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com. And that's where I help out musicians with creating pro-sounding recordings and mixes from their home studios. And if you're looking for a simplified process so that you're not feeling scattered throughout the process of mixing, instead you just want to create amazing sounding mixes, have focus, and know exactly what to do, visit MasterYourMix.com, because on that website, I've got tons of great resources to help you. And one of which that you're going to want to check out is called The Mixing Mindset. It is a book that I created a couple of years ago that is all about simplifying the process of mixing and showing you exactly what order you should do things in, what you should be paying attention to, where to be boosting EQ, when to use compression, when to cut with EQ, when to add effects, automation, all of that kind of stuff. It makes it super clear so that you know exactly what to do with your mixes, so you can get better mixes done in less time and feel way more confident with the end results. So once again, check that out. It's called The Mixing Mindset. It's available at MasterYourMix.com. So that is it for this episode. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you in the next one, guys. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.